You teach two courses at Toronto University, Maps of Meaning and Personality. All your lectures are available on YouTube, and you can either watch them as a whole or you can see bits and pieces. And this is in part what has made you world famous and gained you tremendous support. And those videos, they seem to be full of all sorts of coaching advices, from raising children to relationship advices, being a good person and facing all sorts of challenges. Can you talk a little bit about these two courses? Tell us a little bit about
the Maps of Meaning course is based on a book I wrote, which was my first book, called Maps of Meaning, which is coming out in audio form on June 12th. It's a very difficult book, I would say. I wrote it not so much to communicate, let's say, with the general public, but to address and attempt to solve a very complex problem. And I was curious about why the world had found itself in a stalemate after World War II with the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, say, arming themselves ever more insanely in this ideological deadlock. And I was curious about why the belief systems that each side was putting forward seemed so important that it was worth risking the world itself to support them. And so Maps of Meaning is an inquiry into the purpose of belief systems. And more than that...
And it goes down to the individual.
Yes, well, that's the thing, is that what I came to understand, I think, was that the proper way forward, the proper way of conceptualizing the world is one that's individual-centered. Now, and I was curious about that because, of course, the Soviet view was a collectivist view, and you can make a strong case for a collectivist view, and it might be that either view, the individualist view or the collective view, is arbitrary in some sense, but I don't believe that the view that privileges the individual over the state is arbitrary. I think that it's correct, and correct meaning that if you act it out in the world at the individual level or the family level or the societal level, that it produces societies that are functional and healthy and productive and safe and secure and free in the medium to long term. I think that and then I tried to lay out the psychological reasons for the development of the idea of the sovereign individual, and to show that that was grounded in more than arbitrary ideology. And so Maps of Meaning, the course, that's been a very popular course. I taught that at Harvard for 6 years and then at the University of Toronto ever since. And it's generally regarded as a course that changes people's lives.
Yeah, and so many of your students say that.
Yes, it's a very common response.
And why do you think that is? How does it change the students?
Well, we have a lot of explicit thoughts that we can articulate, but they're grounded in other forms of thinking. They're grounded in images and artistic expression and narratives. So we're fundamentally grounded in the world inside stories. And Maps of Meaning is an attempt to lay out the structure of those stories and to say, look, here's how the world is composed. It's composed of chaos and order, which is a strange way of looking at it. And on top of that, there's an ethical struggle which has been formulated most typically as a battle between good and evil. And I think that that's the right way of looking at the world, is that human beings are engaged in the struggle between good and evil on a background of chaos and order. And Maps of Meaning is an attempt to explain what those categories mean in terms that you can grip and that you can use conceptually and practically in the world. So it's not merely a high-level abstract discussion, although it is that in part. It's an attempt to take that high-level abstract discussion and say, here's why, if you know that, you will be able to operate more effectively in the world. And I think that once you know these categories, you can operate more effectively in the world. It strengthens your resilience in the face of catastrophe, for example. It's encouraging. It helps reestablish the dignity of the individual and to describe why that's a real thing, and the most real thing even. And so it's very salutary for people, because everyone doubts the utility. People doubt their own value. That's probably the most precise way of putting it. And there are reasons that you shouldn't doubt your value. There are deep reasons, and so Maps of Meaning lays that out.
There was one thing that grabbed me. You were talking about what sort of person you want to be when you're in the face of maybe a death in the family. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Things, well, you know, people, it's not easy for people to determine what their goals should be in our culture, because our culture is, I would say, materialistic, and there's some positive things about that, but somewhat shallow in its ethical orientation. And so we think, well, people should strive to be happy, and I think that that's a weak aim. Not that there's anything wrong with being happy. If it happens, great, but it's a side effect of something else.
I see.
It's not a goal in and of itself. A better goal is to be courageous and resilient and strong. And one of the...
But that's a taboo today, some would say.
It's because people don't understand it well. Like, I've told my students that they should try to be the strongest person at their father's funeral. Because you're going to face tremendous adversity in your life, and you need to think through what sort of person you want to be under conditions of adversity. And a funeral is a very good example of that, because it's a catastrophe for everyone involved, and someone has to bear the responsibility to navigate the ship of the family through the storms of the death. And if you think about a person that can do that, obviously such a person is admirable, and there's every reason to set your goal as the development of an admirable character. Something else we don't talk about anymore. It's as if the whole idea of admirable character has been dispensed with.
Yes.
And I think that's associated with the idea, at least in part, of the tyrannical patriarchy. You know, if our culture is nothing but a tyrannical patriarchy, which it is most decidedly not, then anyone who takes forthright action in that structure is nothing but a patriarchal tyrant. It's like none of that is reasonable.
So this is a really negative narrative, this whole patriarchy idea.
It's a terrible narrative. And I think the purpose of the narrative is fundamentally to blur the distinction between competence and power.